Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving deep, really deep, into a question that's at the heart of both science and philosophy. What is scientific progress? What does it even, actually mean?
It might seem like a pretty simple question at first glance.
Yeah, you discover new stuff, science moves forward.
Right. But, as any philosopher will tell you, things get a lot more complicated, a lot more quickly than you'd expect.
Yeah, for sure. Which is why this deep dive is, I think, can be perfect for you listening in, because we're going to really get into the nitty-gritty philosophical side of all this using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on scientific progress as our guide. I'm
Yeah.
really excited to dig into this.
It's a really great resource, really. It goes way beyond that simple new discoveries equal progresses thing.
Exactly. And the first thing that struck me, right out of the gate, was that the idea of science as something that's inherently progressive, that's actually a relatively recent concept.
Yeah, you're right. It's closely tied to the Enlightenment. You know how they were all about reason, empirical observation, and that belief that, we can use these tools to sort of steadily improve our understanding of the world. Before that, people thought about progress, maybe in cycles or
Mhm.
tied into religious ideas.
So we're seeing right off the bat that this idea of progress is loaded with values, right? It's
Right.
about making judgments, about deciding what's better. It's not just describing what happens in science, it's an evaluation.
Absolutely. And that's really where things get super interesting for philosophers, because if progress is not just about collecting more and more facts, well, then how do we even define it? What makes something progress?
That's a great question. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy breaks down all these different ways that science can advance, like getting more funding, becoming more professionalized, developing new methods, all that. But the kind of progress that we're really focusing on here, the kind of at the heart of our deep dive, is cognitive progress.
Right, because that kind of progress is all about getting closer to the truth, which, any philosopher worth their salt knows that truth is a whole other can of worms.
Totally. And the entry makes this super important distinction between actual progress, the stuff we might never actually be able to totally prove, and what just looks like progress based on what we know right now.
Yeah, and that distinction is essential. We might be working with a theory that's incredibly successful, that solves all kinds of problems and feels a lot like progress, real progress.
But then wham, it turns out to be flawed or incomplete in some way we never even thought of.
Exactly. When we shifted from Newtonian mechanics to Einstein's theory of relativity, Newtonian mechanics was hugely successful, explains so much about the physical world, but then Einstein comes along and shows us there's this whole deeper level that we were totally missing.
Like you think you've climbed to the top of the mountain, but then you realize there's this whole other taller mountain behind it.
Yeah, exactly. And that takes us to another really interesting philosophical debate. You know, the entry highlights this. What's the real goal of science anyway? Is it all about solving problems? Some philosophers, like Thomas Kuhn, that's what they say. Or are we really trying to reach the truth, even if we can't ever fully get there?
Now, for a philosopher, that question is the core of the matter because it shapes how we understand this whole concept of scientific progress. And it's also tied to how we think about scientific theories, right? Are they supposed to actually describe reality or are they just useful tools?
Yeah, that's the big debate, right? Realism versus instrumentalism. Realists think that scientific theories are all about giving us a true picture of reality, even the stuff we can't directly observe.
Well, instrumentalists are a bit more down to earth, right? They see these theories as tools to make predictions and help us understand what we see, but they don't necessarily assume that these theories are giving us the absolute truth about reality. Yeah.
Right. So for a realist, scientific progress means we're getting closer and closer to this true description of reality, like uncovering a picture piece by piece.
And for an instrumentalist, progress is more about finding better tools, theories that are really good at predicting and explaining what we see, even if they don't necessarily reflect some ultimate truth about the world.
Right, right. And then that brings up the question of, well, how do you even measure scientific progress? The entry looks at a bunch of different ideas: simplicity, explanatory power, how many problems a theory can solve. But it becomes pretty clear that there's no one magic formula for saying this is definitely progress.
It seems like every metric has its own strengths and its own weaknesses, its own blind spots,
Yeah.
right? And as you said before, you always have to consider the historical context. What seemed like a huge breakthrough at one time might later seem pretty limited, even wrong.
Yeah, and that's where things get really interesting, even for someone like you who's steeped in philosophy. The entry goes into this concept of truth-likeness, this idea that Karl Popper developed and then others kind of refined.
Okay, so now my brain's starting to hurt a little. Basically, you're saying truth-likeness is a way of saying that a theory can be closer to the truth than another, even if both theories are technically wrong.
It's a tricky concept, yeah, but it's really important for understanding this whole thing about scientific progress. It's like, imagine you're shooting at a target. One arrow might miss the bullseye totally, but still be closer than another arrow that's way off in the other direction.
So even a theory that's wrong, it can still have more truth than another wrong theory if it's like pointing us in the right direction.
Exactly. And truth-likeness is a way to make that idea, that intuition, more rigorous. It helps us compare theories even when they're both flawed and see which one is closer to the truth, you know?
This seems like a super useful tool, especially because, historically, most of what we think we know scientifically is probably going to be replaced by something better eventually, right?
Exactly. Truth-likeness lets us say, okay, our knowledge is always changing, but we're still moving in the right direction.
Okay, so truth-likeness is like powerful, but the entry doesn't stop there. It also gets into this argument from Alex Bird, this philosopher, who says that real scientific progress needs justified true beliefs, not just stumbling on the truth by accident.
And this raises a really interesting point. Can you really have scientific progress if your beliefs aren't based on, good reasons? Like, if we just stumble on the truth by chance, is that really progress? Where do you stand on that?
It gets right to the relationship between like truth, belief, and justification.
Whoa. Okay, and as if that wasn't enough to chew on, the entry throws in another wrench, something called incommensurability. So the idea is it's super hard to compare different scientific theories objectively, because even how we observe things is shaped by the theory we're using. It's like we're looking at the world through these different lenses, and those lenses affect what we see and how we understand it.
Yeah, I get it. So how can we ever really say for sure that one theory is better than another when they might be working with totally different ways of understanding things?
It's like trying to compare apples and oranges. Right. They're both fruit, but they're just fundamentally different. This whole incommensurability thing, it's a real thorn in the side for philosophers of science, especially for those who are trying to define like a clear and objective idea of what scientific progress even is.
It reminds me of that thing Thomas Kuhn talked about, how paradigm shifts in science are like gestalt switches, where you're looking at something and suddenly you see it in this totally different way.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. It shows how, when our theoretical framework changes, our whole understanding of the world can shift. It even makes it hard to, talk about progress in a straightforward way, because what we're using to judge progress, that might change too, right along with the paradigm.
So with all this complexity, can we even say for sure that science is progressive? Are we just chasing after something that's always changing, a target we can never actually hit?
It's a really tough question, and not surprisingly, there's no easy answer. It really comes down to your philosophical perspective, you know? But the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry, it seems to lean towards a kind of cautious optimism, I'd say, even though it recognizes these challenges like incommensurability and the fact that our theories always influence what we observe.
I'm sensing a but coming.
Of course. A lot of that optimism comes from the scientific realist point of view, that idea that our theories are at least trying to describe, reality as it is, independent of our minds. If that's the goal, then the theories that are more truth-like, even if they're not perfectly accurate, those represent progress.
So even if we never find, the one true theory of everything, we can still make progress by getting closer to that ideal, right? Making theories that are more truth-like than the ones that came before.
Right. And there's another argument for scientific progress. It's called the no miracles argument. Basically, it says that the fact that science works so well, like we can use it to build bridges and cure diseases and send rockets into space, that would be a total fluke, a miracle, if our theories weren't at least partly true.
So the fact that science actually works, that's a good sign, right?
Yeah.
Suggests we're on the right track, getting closer to understanding the universe.
Exactly. Now, this doesn't mean that every single thing that's ever happened in science has been a step forward. Obviously, there have been mistakes, wrong turns, dead ends, plenty of those.
Oh yeah, for sure. The history of science is full of those. But the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it seems to be saying that the overall trend, the big picture, that shows progress, like a road with lots of curves and detours, but ultimately it's going somewhere.
And it's really important to remember that even when a scientific theory is eventually replaced by a better one, it doesn't mean the old theory was completely useless. It might still be useful for certain things, or it might have parts of the truth that are then refined and built upon by later theories.
So like Newtonian mechanics is a perfect example. We know it's not the whole story, but it's still incredibly useful for all sorts of things.
Exactly. Those, quote, false theories, they can still contribute to progress by laying the groundwork for new discoveries. And, like we talked about before, they can still be truth-like in the sense that they have some truth in them, which is then expanded on by later theories.
Okay, so we've kind of established that science can be progressive, that it has made real progress over time. But how do we deal with the fact that what looks like progress now might turn out to be wrong later? It feels a little shaky, like building a tower on a foundation that could move at any moment.
That's where that distinction between real progress and our estimates of progress comes in. We can never be absolutely 100% sure that we're making real progress because our knowledge, it's always provisional, always open to revision. It's like navigating by the stars.
Mm.
We can chart a course, but we got to be ready to adjust as we get more information.
So in a way, we're always taking a bit of a gamble when we say science is making progress.
In a sense, yeah, but that's also what makes science so exciting. We're constantly pushing the limits of what we know, trying to refine our understanding, trying to get a clearer picture of the universe. And even if we, trip up or take a wrong turn, we still learn something along the way. We're making our map better, you could say.
So even if we can't be totally sure we're on the right path, the process of scientific inquiry itself, all that testing and revising, that's a form of progress in itself.
That's a really good way to put it. We're learning more about the world, even when we're learning that what we thought we knew was wrong or incomplete. We're narrowing down the possibilities, getting closer to how things really are.
That makes sense. But I'm still stuck on this incommensurability thing. If what we see is always affected by the theories we're using, how can we even compare theories to say that one shows more progress than another? It's like we're trapped in our own little theoretical worlds, and we can't really judge which one is better.
It's a good point, a valid concern, but there are ways to think about it. One way is to accept that maybe perfect objectivity isn't possible, but we can still aim for intersubjectivity. That means trying to get a shared understanding, something that goes beyond our individual viewpoints. We can do that by talking to each other, comparing what we find, and looking for areas where we agree.
So even if our theories influence what we observe, we could still have real conversations, compare our results, and maybe come to some kind of agreement about which theories are better at explaining the world.
Exactly. It's about finding common ground, building a shared understanding, even if we're coming at it from different theoretical angles. And another approach is to focus on the practical stuff, the things science helps us do. If the theory leads to new technology, new medical treatments, solutions to real problems, that's a good indicator of progress, even if it doesn't perfectly capture some ultimate truth.
Right. If a theory helps us build a better bridge or come up with a new vaccine, that's a good sign it's on the right track, even if it doesn't perfectly reflect the underlying reality.
Exactly. Those practical successes, they can actually be evidence for the truth-likeness of a theory. If it lets us make accurate predictions and do things in the real world, that suggests it's at least somewhat aligned with how things actually work. Like a map. If it helps you get around a city, it's probably a pretty good map, even if it doesn't show every little detail perfectly.
So we're seeing that there are different ways to think about and evaluate scientific progress, even with all these philosophical challenges. It's not a simple answer. It's a whole process with lots of different parts.
And don't forget, these philosophical debates are still going on. They're part of what makes scientific inquiry so dynamic, so constantly evolving. Philosophers are always working to better understand what science is, how it works, and what it means to make progress. It's a conversation that never really ends.
It's like science is this living thing, constantly growing and changing, and our philosophical understanding of it has to grow and change right along with it.
That's a great way to put it, and I think that's a key takeaway for our listener. Even if we don't have all the answers about scientific progress, just asking these questions, grappling with these ideas, that's a sign of real intellectual curiosity. It means you're committed to pushing the boundaries of what we understand.
Okay, so as we're wrapping up our deep dive into this whole scientific progress thing, I feel like we've covered a lot, but I'm also walking away with, even more to think about.
I think that's what philosophy does, right? Leaves you with more questions than answers. But those questions, those are what make us keep searching, keep trying to understand more.
For sure. So just to recap, What were some of the big takeaways about scientific progress? What should our listeners really remember from this deep dive?
Well, the first thing I think is that scientific progress is way more complicated than it might seem at first. It's not just about finding new facts or making new discoveries, right? It's about values, judgments, and this constant back and forth between what we think, our theories, and what we see, our observations.
Yeah, we looked at all those different philosophical ideas about how science progresses, right? Like
Right.
the realists who are all about getting closer to the truth, the actual truth of reality, and the instrumentalists who focus more on whether theories are useful for explaining and predicting things.
Right. And then there was that truth likeness idea that was a mind bender, but so interesting. Saying that one theory can be closer to the truth than another, even if both of them are technically wrong. That helps us understand how science can keep moving forward, even when our theories get replaced by better ones later on.
And we can't forget that tricky business of incommensurability, right?
Yeah.
That our observations are always going to be influenced by the theory we're using. That makes it hard to compare theories objectively and say for sure which one is really better.
Definitely. But even with all that, we also saw that there are reasons to be optimistic about scientific progress. Like that no miracles argument. It says that science wouldn't work so well, wouldn't be so successful if our theories weren't at least getting something right about how the world actually is.
And even when a theory gets replaced, it can still be part of progress, right?
Mm.
It might lay the groundwork for future discoveries or have some truth in it that gets refined later on. Like each theory is a stepping stone, getting us closer to understanding the whole picture.
Yeah, like a stepping stone. That's a good way to put it. And I think that goes back to the power of the scientific method itself, constantly testing, revising, refining our theories based on new evidence. That process, even when it means letting go of an old theory, is a form of progress in itself.
It's like we're on this huge journey of exploration. And even if we take a wrong turn or hit a dead end, we're still learning something new about the territory.
Exactly. Which leads us back to that question you asked earlier. If all our theories are probably going to be replaced someday, is the idea of progress just an illusion?
It's a question I've been thinking about a lot during this deep dive.
It's a big one, no doubt, and I don't think there's one right answer. But, even if what we know now is replaced by something better later on, that process, that effort to refine our understanding, to get a more complete and truthful picture of the world, that's progress.
So it's not just about getting to some final destination, but about the journey itself, right? That
Hmm.
constant search for knowledge, that willingness to change our minds when we learn new things.
Exactly. And I think that's a powerful message, something really inspiring for anyone who's, curious about the world, who wants to find the truth. Even if we never have all the answers, the journey itself, it's full of amazing things, discoveries, and a deeper understanding of the universe and our place in it.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. But like with any good philosophical discussion, this is really just the beginning. For you listening, keep thinking about these questions, explore the stuff we've talked about, and keep looking for new ideas and perspectives.
Keep asking those big questions, the ones that really challenge you, and never stop exploring this incredible world of science and progress. And until next time, keep on diving deep.